There are moments when an act of pure compassion sets in motion a chain of events so powerful it transforms not just one life but entire futures. When a choice made from the heart rather than the head becomes the turning point between despair and hope. This is the story of such a moment, set in the harsh landscape of New Mexico Territory in 1881, where a struggling widow and her 3 young children faced starvation and ruin but still found room in their hearts to save a dying stranger. It is a tale about sacrifice rewarded, kindness repaid 1,000-fold, and the mysterious ways that helping others can change our own destiny in ways we never imagined. The widow's name was Margaret Sullivan, and her children were Emma, age 10, Thomas, age 8, and little Sarah, who had just turned 5. The dying cowboy they found bleeding in the desert was named William Thornton, though they would not learn his full identity until much later, and by then, everything about their lives would be different. This is their story, a testament to how mercy and generosity plant seeds that grow into miracles, and how sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. Margaret Sullivan had been a widow for 14 months when this story begins, struggling to keep her small homestead alive and her children fed after her husband Henry died from a rattlesnake bite that turned poisonous faster than anyone could help him. Henry had claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act and had been slowly building a life for his family on that harsh land, but his death left Margaret with debts she could not pay, crops she could not harvest alone, and a future that looked increasingly hopeless. Margaret was 32 years old but looked older, her face lined with worry and her hands rough from work that never seemed to end. She rose before dawn and worked until long after dark, trying to do the labor of 2 adults while also caring for 3 young children who needed food and attention and comfort she barely had energy to provide. The small vegetable garden behind their rough cabin produced just enough to keep them from starving, and Margaret sold eggs from their few chickens whenever she could spare any, but it was never quite enough. The children wore clothes patched so many times there was more patch than original fabric, and they went to bed hungry more nights than Margaret wanted to admit. On a scorching July afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer and every breath felt like inhaling fire, 10-year-old Emma was walking back from checking the creek that ran along the edge of their property when she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. There was a man lying face down in the scrub brush about 50 yards from their boundary fence, and even from a distance, Emma could see blood staining the ground around him. She ran back to the cabin calling for her mother, her voice high with fear and excitement. Margaret came running with Thomas and Sarah behind her, and together they approached the fallen man carefully, unsure if he was alive or dead or dangerous. When they got close enough to see clearly, Margaret gasped at the sight of multiple gunshot wounds across the man's back and side, blood soaked through his shirt and his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. The man was unconscious and, burning with fever, his lips cracked from thirst, and his face gray beneath the dust and blood. Margaret knew immediately that this man would die without help, probably within hours in this heat, and she faced a terrible decision that would determine the course of all their lives. Margaret had 3 children to feed, and barely enough resources to keep them alive. Taking in a dying stranger would mean using precious water they could not spare, food they desperately needed, and time and energy Margaret barely had left at the end of each exhausting day. The practical choice, the safe choice, was to leave this man where he lay or perhaps send word to town and let someone else deal with the situation. But Margaret Sullivan had not survived the death of her husband and 14 months of desperate poverty by being the kind of person who could walk away from suffering, and she had been raised to believe that you helped people in need regardless of the cost because that was simply what decent human beings did. She told Emma to run and fetch their old blanket while she and Thomas tried to move the wounded man. Between the 3 of them, they managed to drag the unconscious cowboy back to their cabin, a journey of nearly 200 yards that left them all exhausted and the man's wounds bleeding fresh from the movement. They laid the stranger on the floor of their small cabin because there was nowhere else to put him, and Margaret sent the children to draw water from the well while she began the overwhelming task of trying to save this man's life with no medical training and almost no supplies. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt and examined the wounds as best she could with shaking hands. There were 3 bullet holes, two that appeared to have passed through clean, and one lodged somewhere in his shoulder. Margaret had watched the doctor in town work on injuries before Henry died, and she did her best to remember what she had seen. She boiled water and used strips torn from one of her own dresses to clean the wounds, knowing that infection killed as surely as bullets. The man cried out in pain during this process, but never fully regained consciousness. Margaret found the bullet in his shoulder and removed it with a knife she sterilized in the fire, her stomach turning as she worked but her hands steady because there was no one else to do this terrible necessary task. She bandaged the wounds with more strips of precious fabric and covered the stranger with their only spare blanket, then sat back exhausted and unsure if anything she had done would make any difference. For 3 days and nights, Margaret and her children took turns sitting with the dying cowboy, giving him water drop by drop when he was conscious enough to swallow, changing his bandages when blood seeped through, and keeping him covered when fever made him shake with chills despite the summer heat. Emma proved to have a natural gift for nursing, sitting patiently and talking to the unconscious man in a soft voice, telling him he needed to fight and stay alive. Thomas fetched endless buckets of water from the well without complaint, even though his small arms ached. Little Sarah picked wildflowers and put them in a cup near the stranger's head, because she said sick people needed pretty things to look at. Margaret used water they needed for their garden and food they could not spare to make broth that she spooned into the man's mouth whenever he was alert enough to swallow. She did not know his name or where he came from or why someone had shot him, and she did not care, because none of that mattered when someone was dying, and you had the ability to help. On the 4th day, the cowboy's fever finally broke and he opened his eyes with clarity for the first time. He looked around the rough cabin with confusion, taking in the dirt floor and the sparse furniture and the thin children staring at him with wide eyes. His voice came out as a cracked whisper when he asked where he was and what had happened. Margaret explained that her daughter had found him dying in the brush, that they had brought him to their cabin and tended his wounds for 4 days. The man stared at Margaret like he could not quite believe what he was hearing, and he asked why she would help a complete stranger, especially when it was obvious from looking around that she had very little to spare. Margaret told him simply that it was the right thing to do, that you do not leave people to die when you have the power to help them, and that she hoped someone would do the same for her children if they were ever in such desperate need. The cowboy's eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away, and he told Margaret his name was William and thanked her for saving his life. He said he had been ambushed by cattle thieves who left him for dead, and he had been trying to reach help when he finally collapsed. William tried to sit up, but immediately gasped with pain and fell back, and Margaret told him firmly that he needed to rest and heal before trying to move anywhere. William stayed in the Sullivan cabin for 3 weeks, while his wounds slowly healed under Margaret's careful attention. During that time, he watched this small family with growing amazement and admiration. He saw how Margaret worked herself to exhaustion every single day, doing the labor of multiple people while also caring for her children with patience and love. He watched Emma take on responsibilities no 10-year-old should have to bear, cooking meals and mending clothes and caring for her younger siblings when Margaret was working in the fields. He saw Thomas trying so hard to be the man of the family at age 8, choking back tears when his hands blistered from work but refusing to stop. He noticed little Sarah's hollow cheeks and the way all 3 children looked at food with the desperate hunger of people who never quite got enough to eat. William observed that the cabin had almost nothing in it, that the furniture was rough and handmade, that there were holes in the roof where rain would pour through, and that this family was barely surviving despite working harder than most people he had ever known. He learned that Margaret's husband had died leaving debts, that the bank was threatening to foreclose on their homestead, that Margaret owed money to the general store and had no way to pay it. And he watched Margaret share her family's meager food with him without hesitation, giving him portions she should have kept for her children, sacrificing what little they had, because she had decided to save him, and she would not do it halfway. As William grew stronger, he began to help around the cabin despite Margaret's protests that he needed to rest. He mended the holes in the roof and fixed the broken fence posts and showed Thomas how to set snares for rabbits that provided meat they desperately needed. He was gentle with the children and respectful to Margaret, and he never asked intrusive questions about their circumstances even though their poverty was painfully obvious. What William did not tell the Sullivan family, what they had no way of knowing, was that he was not just some ordinary cowboy recovering from an ambush. William Thornton was one of the wealthiest ranchers in New Mexico Territory, owner of the massive Thornton Ranch that sprawled across thousands of acres and employed over 100 men. He had been riding alone, checking on his herds when the thieves attacked him, and his men had surely been searching for him for weeks now, probably thinking he was dead. William had said nothing about his true identity because he wanted to understand this family who had saved him, wanted to see their true character without the complication of his wealth influencing their behavior. And what he saw convinced him that he had found something rare and precious, a family with the kind of honor and decency that no amount of money could buy. After 3 weeks, William was healed enough to travel, and he told Margaret it was time for him to return to his life. Margaret nodded and said she was glad he had recovered, that it had been good to help him, and she asked for nothing in return except perhaps that he remember to help someone else if he ever had the opportunity. William asked Margaret how much money she needed to save the homestead and pay off her debts. Margaret looked embarrassed and said she did not want charity, that they would manage somehow. William pressed the question, and Margaret finally admitted that she owed $300 to the bank and another $100 to various creditors in town, an impossible sum that might as well have been $3 million for all the chance she had of raising it. William reached into his saddlebag, which Emma had found in the brush near where her mother had discovered him, and which Margaret had carefully preserved. He pulled out a leather wallet and counted out $500 in bills, placing them on the rough wooden table. Margaret stared at the money like it was a hallucination, and she immediately tried to refuse, saying it was too much, that she could not possibly accept such a sum from someone who probably needed it himself. William smiled and told Margaret that he had not been entirely honest with her about who he was. He explained that he owned the Thornton Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory, and that $500 was nothing compared to what her family had given him by saving his life and caring for him when they had every reason to focus on their own survival. He told Margaret that she and her children had shown him more genuine kindness and generosity in 3 weeks than he had experienced in years of dealing with people who wanted something from him because of his wealth. William said the money was not charity but payment of a debt he could never fully repay, and he insisted Margaret take it with his gratitude. Margaret's hands shook as she touched the bills, tears streaming down her face as she realized this money would save everything, would give her children security and a future, and hope that had seemed impossible just moments before. Emma and Thomas and little Sarah crowded around staring at the fortune on their table, and Sarah asked if this meant they could buy food and not be hungry anymore. But William was not finished. He told Margaret that, in addition to the money, he wanted to offer her a permanent job managing one of his smaller ranch properties about 30 miles from where they currently lived. The house was solid and comfortable, there was good land for farming and raising animals, and the salary would be enough to support her family comfortably with money left over for savings. Margaret would oversee the property and the few hands who worked it, using her obviously capable management skills to run the operation, while William's main ranch handled the larger business. Emma could attend the school in the nearby town, and all 3 children would have opportunities and security that were impossible on their failing homestead. William told Margaret that he was making this offer not out of pity, but because he genuinely believed she had the skills and character to do the job well, and because he wanted to give her family the kind of future they deserved. Margaret could barely speak through her tears as she accepted, understanding that the stranger they had saved from death was now saving them in return, that an act of compassion she had made from the heart was being rewarded in ways she could never have dreamed. 2 weeks later, the Sullivan family moved to their new home on Thornton's property, and their lives transformed in ways that felt like waking from a nightmare into a beautiful dream. The house was larger than anything they had lived in, with real floors and windows that closed tight and a roof that did not leak. There was plenty of food and new clothes for the children and security that let Margaret sleep through the night without constant worry eating at her. Emma attended school and discovered she loved learning, eventually becoming a teacher herself. Thomas grew up working the ranch and learned skills that made him valuable, and he never forgot the lessons about hard work his mother had taught during those desperate years. Little Sarah had a childhood of play and laughter instead of hunger and fear, and she grew up knowing that kindness and compassion were the most important values a person could hold. Margaret managed the property with the same fierce dedication she had applied to her failing homestead, and William came to rely on her judgment and respect her abilities. She never remarried, but she built a good, independent life for herself and her children, and she never forgot that it all started with the choice to help a dying stranger, even when she had almost nothing to give. William Thornton became a close friend of the Sullivan family, visiting regularly and watching the children grow up with the pride of an honorary uncle. He told anyone who would listen about the widow and her children who saved his life when they were barely surviving themselves, who chose compassion over self-preservation, and taught him that true wealth has nothing to do with money in the bank. He used his influence to help other struggling families in the territory, remembering the Sullivans and trying to live up to the example of generosity they had set. When William was an old man facing the end of his own life, he told his lawyer that the Sullivan family had given him something more valuable than all his thousands of acres and all his cattle and all his money. They had restored his faith in human goodness and reminded him what truly mattered, and that gift was beyond price. He left a substantial inheritance to Margaret's children in his will, ensuring that the generosity that had saved his life would echo forward through generations. The story of the poor widow who saved the rich cowboy became one of those tales that people told around campfires and dinner tables, a legend that grew with each retelling but never strayed too far from the truth. It became a story parents told their children to teach them about the importance of helping others regardless of the cost, about how kindness plants seeds that grow in unexpected ways, and about how the universe often rewards those who act from pure hearts without expectation of reward. Margaret Sullivan's choice to sacrifice what little she had to save a dying stranger demonstrated the kind of courage that has nothing to do with facing down outlaws or surviving disasters, but everything to do with choosing love and compassion when fear and self-interest would be easier. Her children learned from her example that you do not have to be rich to be generous, that you do not have to have plenty to share what you have, and that the most important question is never what helping someone will cost you, but what failing to help will cost your soul. Years after these events, when Emma was a grown woman with children of her own, she would tell them the story of the day she found a dying cowboy in the brush, and how her mother's decision to help him changed everything. She would explain that they had been days away from losing their home, that they had been sharing their last food with a stranger when they were already going hungry, and that her mother had made the choice without hesitation because it was simply the right thing to do. Emma would tell her children that the lesson was not that helping people would always result in material rewards, because sometimes kindness cost everything and gave nothing back except the knowledge that you had done right. But she would also tell them that you never knew when an act of compassion might change not just someone else's life but your own, that the stranger you helped today might turn out to be the answer to prayers you did not even know you were praying. And she would remind them that even if William Thornton had been exactly what he appeared, just an ordinary cowboy with nothing to give them in return, saving his life would still have been worth it because some things matter more than survival, and being the kind of person who chooses mercy over self-interest is one of them. The legacy of the poor widow and the rich cowboy she saved endures as a reminder that we are all connected in ways we cannot see, that acts of kindness ripple outward, touching lives we will never know about, and that sometimes the people who seem to have nothing to give are the ones who give the most because they give from the heart rather than from excess. Margaret Sullivan proved that true generosity is measured not by the size of the gift, but by the sacrifice it represents, and that those who help others when they can barely help themselves demonstrate a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with money. William Thornton proved that gratitude and honor still existed even in the rough world of the Wild West, and that a man of true character recognizes and rewards goodness when he encounters it. Together, their story teaches that life has a way of balancing accounts, that mercy shown is often mercy returned, and that the choice to save a dying stranger might just be the choice that saves you right back.